I think I can get this one done much quicker because a lot of what happens, you can see how long that section on the early part of the 60s was. Um, the second part goes a little bit quicker because we have the foundation and know in the background on a lot of this stuff. Let's see if we can't make this one about a 30-minute. By we, I mean me. So we ended with this, the idea of the country's coming apart, assassinations, riots, the war not going very well. Okay, and I throw this in there. This is a little bit more recent. It doesn't go through President Biden, but the line is probably the same. And if you look back at the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and early Johnson administration, trust in government was fairly high, pushing upwards of 80% trusted the government. But then you see this decline, a precipitous decline. Through Johnson, what gets leaked out in the Pentagon Papers, the Watergate scandal that brings down Nixon, Ford is president, but only for a short period. Jimmy Carter, honest man, high inflation, didn't get a lot done, didn't play well with others, so it continues to go down. Under Reagan, we see a bump, and his second campaign was "It's Morning in America" again. So he puts back a little bit of the mojo into the country. Bush's the first HW, that spike is post-Desert Storm, but then the economy starts to sag. And this line drawn with the U.S. economy, they kind of mirror each other. Again, a little buildup under Bill Clinton because the economy recovers, and he's a fairly popular president, honestly. This spike under W. Bush is 9/11 and kind of the patriotism, rally around the flag moment, but then we see it really rocket downwards as the mortgage meltdown and shedding a million jobs a month kick in. And then the next two, Obama, flatline, Trump, flatline, Biden. Started out fairly high, but at this point, his approval rating's down in the 30% range, 37, 38%. So all of these events, starting with the kind of the lying to the country about the Vietnam War, Watergate, assassinations, all these take a toll that we think, man, our government can't do anything right. And it's stayed that way really through your lifetime. So in response to all what's going on, that building up of pressure against the societal structure, we see this counterculture, right? A different style of culture. You know, the hippies, as they were called, because they were hip, so they're hippies, right? Drugs, sex, rock and roll, right? Don't trust anybody over 30 was kind of their bumper sticker. Instant gratification becomes more and more and more prevalent, and it still is today, right? Why do you think phones are so popular? To give you that little instant dopamine hit. And they see, and they're at least partially right, the idea that Eisenhower brought up, the military-industrial complex, that war is not about, you know, saving the world from Nazi Germany. It's about making money. Because if you're making planes and tanks and bombs, you're probably making a good bit during this Vietnam War era. Okay, and music really captures that sentiment. And in class, I've been playing CCR and just other songs in and around. The counterculture high watermark was Woodstock. Okay? And so some pictures of the idea of the peace sign. I'll tell you where that came from. And they do kind of co-opt the V for victory peace sign from World War II. Right? This is what was known as the hog farm. Right? These big kind of communal groups. And the hog farm ran the security at Woodstock. Almost 500,000 people at Woodstock. 2 get killed. 1 gets run over in a field at night by a tractor, unlucky. 1 dies from an overdose, and they do find a third person after the festival is kind of broken up that had likely overdosed, but he was out in the woods in the area around it. But their means of security for the festival was if you acted up, you got sprayed with seltzer water and hit with a pie. So that kind of captures the mentality of the festival. And that large of a group and no issues of, you know, fights and violence. Yes, there was a lot of drug use, but, you know, 2 people dying out of 500,000 is pretty staggering. So here we enter the late 60s era. The war is going so badly that, and this never happens, by the way, President Johnson says, "I will not seek nor will I accept the nomination for presidency." What? An incumbent, right? He took over for Kennedy with just, you know, the last little bit of Kennedy's term. So he was able to run in 68, and he doesn't because the war is going so badly. And so his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, runs, doesn't do very well. Nixon's back after his defeat against Kennedy in 1960. And there's the piece I talked about in the last video of this kind of Dixiecrat white supremacist movement. And you can see George Wallace actually captures a large portion of the old Confederacy. Right? He's the one famously stood on the steps of the University of Alabama blocking black students from entering the university. Right? So that shows some of the popularity and some of the angst in the country about civil rights. Because anytime you try to push things forward, there's going to be resistance against it. And actually Nixon uses that to his advantage. He uses this Southern strategy, as it's called, promoting fear in white voters about things like civil rights, to get some of them at least to come to his side, because you can see some of the old Confederacy goes for Nixon. Texas goes for Hubert Humphrey. That was Johnson's home state. Right? Look at this. That's a landslide. And so it begs the question, leading up to the 72 election, why was Nixon having, or at least allowing, people to go into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel to snoop on them, to install taps on their phones, to spy on the Democrats? He could see the polls. This was no way did George McGovern have a shot, right? And you can see that in the electoral vote. And yet Nixon was so paranoid. He hated leaks. Leaks from within the White House, leaks from within his administration to the press. And so he took some of the people that worked for his campaign, the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, most people called it CREEP, and he had a group called the Plumbers, because plumbers fix leaks. And the plumbers were the ones that broke into the Watergate Hotel. And the very tenuous thread of some money being sent to one of the plumbers' accounts was tied back, not to Nixon directly, but to the White House. And that starts a chain of events that 2 years later breaks open, where Nixon knew and tried to cover up the Watergate break-in. And that really spells his demise. It wasn't the break-in itself. If he'd have come out, my opinion, and said, those knuckleheads, I didn't tell them to do it, but they did it, and I'm the president, so it's my fault, and sorry, it won't happen again, I don't think anything would have happened. It was the 2 years of covering it up that spelled his doom. So much that the cloud of impeachment was right there, and he saw it. And so he ends up resigning the presidency to avoid being impeached, because he would have been. In Vietnam, still there, right? Nixon campaigns in '68 on getting us out of there. Peace with honor, he called it. And so he sees this growth in the protest movement. And what he does is he says, you know what? I'm going to come up with a thing called Vietnamization. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to keep sending beans and bullets, supplies, money, but we're not going to send our boys over there anymore. And we're actually going to start drawing down some of our troops. And that helps the protest movement die down at least a little bit. And by 1972, we're effectively out of Vietnam as far as troops, but we're still supplying them with the supplies of war. I think I got to pause right there. He wanted a settlement. He wanted things done and over in America out, and that was popular. Okay. Congress finally gets wise and says, you know what, we gave the president far too much power, and they pull back those, you tell us when things are good enough over there, Mr. President, because now it's President Nixon, so that gets pulled back. And now the protest, there's kind of still some spikes in it. One of them, the top picture, and it's grim, happens in 1968, but doesn't really break in the U.S. press until '69. It's called the My Lai Massacre. And a group of special forces go into the village of My Lai, where there's supposed to be a bunch of Viet Cong, and it's a bunch of women and children, and yet they still go in and slaughter the village and burn it to the ground. And that breaks in the U.S. press, and that puts the protest movement back into overdrive. And the bottom picture is at Kent State. It was about 30 minutes from where I grew up. There were protests, not just at Kent State, at almost all colleges in America. And at Kent State, they actually burned down a couple buildings on campus. So the governor calls out the National Guard. And when you get highly agitated folks close together, a la the Boston Massacre, something bad's going to happen. And 4 students are shot dead on the campus of Kent State. And so these things still fuel this protest movement that's going on in the country. But they, instead of being respectable, they start to turn more and more violent, as you can see with Kent State. Okay? But again, as we draw down troops, the protest movement kind of draws down in lockstep, because the reason to protest against the war is going away. And so kind of the sad ending of Vietnam, when both sides get together to negotiate a peace treaty, they know what's going to be in the treaty. It's not a surprise. There may be a little bit of negotiation back and forth, but as they meet in 72, it was actually the South Vietnamese government come to the table and go, no, 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 we want this, this, and this as well. And so the North says, we're out. You know, we thought we knew what this was going to be all about. And so in response, Nixon launches what they call the Christmas bombings, massive bombing campaigns over North Vietnam. And one John McCain, prisoner in the Hoa Lo prison, the Hanoi Hilton as they called it, hears these bombings and he writes about knowing that the war is about to be over at that point. Okay. The pictures, the negotiating table, of course, and then this kind of the last helicopter out. At this point, most of the Americans, even from the embassy, things like that, are out of the country. So a lot of these folks trying to pack in and get the heck out of the country were people that worked. They were Vietnamese, but they worked for the U.S. government in some fashion, because they knew if the South was overrun, they would probably be killed. And the Blue Stars are a couple videos of kind of the sad ending of Vietnam, actually pushing helicopters over the edge of boats because there's nowhere, they only have room for one helicopter at a time. And so it shows this mighty power, America pushing its helicopters over the side and kind of leaving Vietnam with its tail between its legs. Okay? And I guess the saddest part is, after we get out of there, the North has to regroup. They were really undercut by the Tet Offensive. But by 1975, it takes them about a month to take all of South Vietnam. So all of that blood and treasure spent in Vietnam made the South Vietnamese government last for about a month. And so that was the mission. The whole thing about Vietnam was not to take over North Vietnam. It was to support the South Vietnamese government. So you can't draw lines on a map because we're not taking over any parts. So we use this idea of how many people did we kill. It was called body count. That's what they kept showing, the military and the president showing the U.S. Look at this. We're winning this war. And then all of a sudden, wham, 1968, Tet Offensive. The North attacks throughout the country. And it's all on TV because we have reporters there. And so the American public goes, what? You've been lying to us. We haven't been winning this war. And that, militarily, it ends up being a victory for the Americans and South Vietnamese. But on the home front, support for the war plummets. And that's what generates a lot of the protests. So we win the battle and yet lose the war because of the Tet Offensive. So some aftermath, just some ideas. 58,000, right? American troops, a lot of blood and treasure spent, and from what we see in our side of things, for no reason, right? And if we leave, who's going to come in? Of course, the Soviet Union. And yes, that's why I showed you that chart. Undermined the public faith of elected officials. It decimated the military after this as well. They were really, the American public blamed the military for the loss, when in fact it's the civilian leadership, the president, the secretaries of the various branches. Those are both civilian positions. They were the ones making the decisions, but it didn't matter. The girl in the picture is actually living in America now. She survived. This was a napalm attack, which is jellied gasoline. So when it burns, it sticks to your skin and burns you. And so the kids are fleeing that village, and she stripped off her clothes because they were on fire. But I asked the question in class, what do you see? And of course the face of terror in the young boy. But the American troops just kind of la la la, it's just another day. And that's part of the dark side of war, is you get immune to suffering. It happens so often that you become a robot almost. This comes about after the war. We as a country decide that we need to train our servicemen and women better at what happens if you go into captivity, i.e. John McCain in the Hoa Lo prison. And so they come up with this tap code where it's not Morse code, but it kind of is, where you can go down 2 over 3. And so you can start spelling out words. Down 2 over 4. Hi. Somebody gets thrown in the cell next to you. And so the POWs would use this. There's a famous video of a guy blinking the word torture by doing this. But you don't have to tap. You can sweep, you can blink your eyes, anything, because it drives you nuts after a while if you're unable to communicate with other people. So that was developed. This is a picture of, I talked about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and you can see it goes through Laos and Cambodia. It doesn't enter Vietnam until they get to the border. But this is where Agent Orange was used to defoliate the jungle so we could bomb some of the supplies coming in. And it wasn't just Agent Orange. The name comes from the rings on the barrels, but there was all kinds of defoliants used. And these things were, yeah, they worked, but they were really bad for those that handled them. And oh, by the way, all this badness happening, a high watermark for the country, landing on the moon, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and the video is an actual footage of. And it's interesting as you watch, you can hear the command and control center on the Earth talking to them, and as they're descending down to the lunar surface, Neil Armstrong actually has to take manual control of the lunar lander, and he ends up burning more fuel because there was rocks in the area they thought they were supposed to land, so he had to move. And you hear as they're descending, deep 60 seconds. That's a warning for that's how much fuel you got left. And by the 30 seconds, they're starting to get close, kicking up dust. But they land on the moon with probably 17 seconds of spare fuel left before they would have had to abort. So it was a pretty close shave and a pretty gutsy piloting job by Neil Armstrong. Hey, and of course, the high watermark, this counterculture. The videos are embedded behind the pictures if you want to watch a couple of them. The Hendrix one gets taken down all the time, so it may not be there. But as the festival develops, 400,000 plus attendees. By the time Hendrix goes on, he was supposed to perform Sunday night, the last act, the headliner. And there's a huge rainstorm. Everything gets delayed. It's way more people than they thought were going to show up. And so he ends up playing Monday morning to a small crowd of maybe 20,000 people are left, and yet he still did it. And that's where he plays the iconic Star Spangled Banner on the guitar. It's the high water mark. There's some attempts afterwards, and there was supposed to be a 50th anniversary a few years ago, and it got canceled just because of the rancor between some of the areas. Nobody wanted to host it again. And so if you go back, it's a long video, but there's a documentary about the 69 festival, and you don't see any of this. Right? There's no AT&T or Coke or Budweiser. There was no sponsorship. The other thing I noticed, my wife and I watched it not too long ago, is everybody was thin back then. Here's the peace sign. I said I'd explain it. It comes from what's called semaphore, and ND stood for nuclear disarmament. And so if you put those two symbols together, that's what you get, the peace sign. That's where it came from. Okay, there's the Watergate Hotel. Nixon is the plumbers breaking in, and now he's covering it up, covering it up, covering it up. 1974, it's finally going to break. Also, we have the first gas crisis. The OPEC countries in the Middle East turn off the spigots a bit. And so the United States, all of a sudden, you can't buy gas whenever you want. And we're feeling a little pinch now with inflation. But this was kind of the, if there was a green flag over the gas station, you come get gas. Yellow flag meant commercial trucks, things like that, and you had to show proof of, and if it was red, there was no gas. And these are lines of people waiting to get gas in the early 70s. And so what does that do? It just quickly, Nixon, pretty much everybody remembers him for Watergate. He did some good things. The EPA, he opens relations with China. Watergate tends to overshadow, and maybe rightly so, but this oil embargo kicks in, and the thing I want to tell you here is in 1960 we imported 1 of 6 barrels of oil used in this country. By the 70s, because we kept building these monstrosities of vehicles, it's up to 1 in 3. 1/3 of our oil has to be imported to keep the country running. And so when that supply shuts down, demand stays the same, the price goes up. And people go through the roofs when they see this. I remember it used to be $0.25, now it's almost $1. Wow. And in this picture, the other thing you see is these kind of American land yachts. Look right there. Volkswagen Beetle and a Toyota Corolla. Small, lightweight, fuel-efficient Japanese cars. And so this is the 70s. Why do you think Toyota, best-selling car in America, Honda's up there? Because at the time they made what people wanted. And the American auto industry was very slow to react. Right. Nixon and leaks. This is probably the biggest one. It's known as the Pentagon Papers. This guy in the picture, Daniel Ellsberg, he spent almost a year with the Marines in Vietnam. He worked for a group called the RAND Corporation, which is kind of a military think tank. He's not some crazy hippie, but he sees the war in Vietnam being prosecuted, and it leaks out in the Pentagon Papers. 70% to save face, 20% to stop China in the area, and 10% to really help the South Vietnamese and win the war. And things like that really change his mind about it. And so he makes copies, because we don't have computers at the time, so you can't just put in a flash drive. It's like many, 47 volumes, this Pentagon report, the Pentagon Papers, and he makes copies and he leaks it to the New York Times. And so the country starts to see that, hey, our military leaders and presidents have been lying to us, on top of the Tet Offensive piece. And so Nixon calls him the most dangerous man in America, or Kissinger, his Secretary of State, one of the two. And they really go after this guy. And they plant evidence that he's nuts in his psychiatrist's office and things like that. The blue stars are kind of a summation of Daniel Ellsberg in the Pentagon Papers. Okay? So he does send him to the Times. The New York Times is surrounded by armed guards. And finally, Nixon's able to get an injunction and stop the publication in the Times. So what happens? Ellsberg makes another copy and sends it to the Washington Post. And they keep publishing them. And there's a movie with Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep about that. Right? So it keeps getting out as to what the administration was doing. And so that just fuels Nixon's paranoia about people leaking information. And so what does he do about it? I'm going to find out who's doing this. So he sets up a series of tapes of recording devices in and around the White House and his staff areas, and they record everything so that way he can catch who's leaking it. Well, guess what? Those tapes also catch Nixon admitting to covering up the Watergate break-in. And it becomes known as the smoking gun tape. He refuses to release it to the commission studying the Watergate break-in. And finally, he does release it, and they play it, and there's an 18-minute gap in the tape. Shh, nothing. Like, what's this? And he says, oh, my secretary must have had her foot on the record button and messed it up. And so they go in and actually ask the secretary to show us. How would that work? And if she reaches for the phone, if she does anything in her office, she can't keep her foot on that button. So they go, that's BS. And Nixon finally does give him that tape without the 18-minute gap. And that's the end for Nixon. So that's kind of a summation of. Now you can read more about the specifics. Again, it's like a semester-long study. But Nixon goes into his own shell. He starts firing people left and right. You can look through this. It's known as the Saturday Night Massacre. That he wants to fire people that aren't supportive of him because he's a very paranoid person. And there's the Rosemary Wood Stretch, the secretary. She cannot keep her foot on the pedal no matter what she does. So that's bunk. And so as the smoking gun tape is released, some of Nixon's, I guess you could say, supporters in the Congress come to him. The Republicans, they say, man, any support you have is just evaporated. There are 3 articles of impeachment being drafted up in the House, and of course that would go to the Senate for vote, and Nixon can see the writing on the wall. And so with that, he goes, you know what, I don't have the support, I am going to resign. And he does. And I remember watching this live on television. Okay, so there's the support. There's the link to him resigning. It's a very short speech, but if you listen to it, it's almost like he's saying, I'm doing this for the betterment of the country. Yeah, you got caught, pal. So I don't buy that. And so his original vice president, a guy named Spiro Agnew, had to resign for tax problems, tax evasion. So he picked Gerald Ford. That's how it works. You just pick your replacement vice president. And now when Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford becomes president. So Ford was never elected. And he was the president. That's the question here. Never elected. Right? So we move into the Jimmy Carter era. Ford runs a fairly decent campaign, but he pardons Nixon of crimes, probably to put the whole Watergate episode behind us, but that makes a lot of people angry with Ford. And so, yes, it's close-ish, but Jimmy Carter wins the election, and he really tries to promote peace throughout the world, but especially in the Middle East between the Egyptians and Israelis. And so he has a summit with Menachem Begin here, Anwar Sadat, right? There's Jimmy Carter. And they sign a peace agreement. And it is so unpopular in Egypt that Anwar Sadat goes home to a parade and he's assassinated at that parade. So that's what happens when people don't like your policies. As Carter's president, the Soviet Union decides to invade Afghanistan. Inflation, oil prices all going up, very much akin to what we're experiencing now, albeit double the rate of inflation. It's astronomical. So things in the world are uneasy. Okay? And that leads to this Iranian hostage crisis. Now this is a presentation that, in fact, you helped work on, so I don't need to go over it. But we go all the way back to Operation Ajax, overthrow Mossadegh, plug in the Shah. At this point, 1979, the Shah is sick, flees the country, goes to America. The Iranians want the Shah's head on a plate. We don't give the Shah back to be prosecuted, and so they attack our embassy and hold our hostages for 444 days. And that kind of is the end of an era where the United States, it's called a malaise. It's like this just bad, uneasy feeling throughout the country. All of the things that have gone on since the assassination of Kennedy really kind of culminate here. And that's where we'll pick up for the last two chapters. We're going to listen to a little bit of Jimmy Carter, or you will, Jimmy Carter's speech about what's wrong with the country. And I still listen to it today, and he says we got two paths, and we took the wrong path. I'll just tell you that much. Okay? So look at that. Shorter, sweeter, etc. Done. 26 minutes. That'll set you up for the quiz, and I'll put that in the email as well.